In the heart of rural Texas, far from the hum of big cities, lay Meadow Ridge, a town where time seemed to amble as lazily as the creek running through its center. The streets were lined with modest homes, each with neatly kept yards, and the town's main attraction was a diner that doubled as a community hub. For John and his son Michael, this town was both a sanctuary and a battlefield. John, a 72-year-old retired mechanic, was once known for his sharp mind and impeccable work ethic. He had spent decades running a small garage on Meadow Ridge's main road, earning the respect of the locals for his ability to bring even the most stubborn engines back to life. But now, Alzheimer's was slowly stealing those memories and skills. His once bright blue eyes, framed by a face weathered by years of hard work in the Texan sun, often held a distant look, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Michael, in his late 30s, had returned to Meadow Ridge after years of living in Dallas, where he worked in IT. The transition hadn't been easy. He'd left behind a promising career and a social life to care for his father full-time. Standing at 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, Michael had the physique of someone used to hard work, though his posture carried the weight of his responsibilities. His days were a delicate balancing act of working remotely and looking after John, who required constant supervision. Their home, a modest single-story house with peeling white paint and a porch that creaked underfoot, was both a comfort and a source of strain. The living room, once filled with the sound of John's laughter and music from his record player, was now quieter, save for the occasional hum of the ceiling fan or John's soft murmurs as he sat staring out the window. "Michael, where's your mother?" John asked one morning, his voice tinged with confusion. He sat at the kitchen table, turning an empty coffee cup in his hands. Michael, standing by the sink, paused. He'd heard this question a dozen times before that week alone. His mother had passed away years ago, but John's mind often dragged her into the present. "She's resting, Dad," Michael replied carefully, avoiding the truth to spare his father unnecessary grief. John nodded slowly, as if the answer satisfied some lingering question. Then, almost as quickly, he looked up with a furrowed brow. "Why don't I remember that?" Michael sighed, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "It's okay, Dad. Don't stress about it. Let's get you some breakfast." The morning routine was one of the few constants in their lives. Michael would make John his favorite scrambled eggs and toast, though some days John would forget he'd eaten moments after finishing his plate. The days blurred together in a rhythm dictated by John's needs. Michael's laptop was perpetually open on the dining table, where he worked while keeping an eye on his father. But as the weeks passed, Michael couldn't ignore the toll this lifestyle was taking on him. His energy waned, and a quiet frustration began to creep in. He loved his father deeply, but the weight of caregiving sometimes felt insurmountable. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Michael stepped onto the porch to catch his breath. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the fields that stretched beyond their backyard. He leaned against the wooden railing, staring at the horizon. A part of him missed the life he'd left behind in Dallas, yet another part couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Inside, John wandered into the living room, his gait slow and deliberate. He picked up a framed photo from the mantel, an image of a younger him with Michael and his wife, taken years ago during a family barbecue. He stared at it for a long time before calling out, "Mike, come here. Who are these people?" Michael, closing his eyes for a brief moment, re-entered the house. He crouched next to his father and placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's us, Dad. That's our family." John looked at the photo again and nodded, though his expression betrayed a flicker of doubt. "We look happy," he said quietly. Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. "We were, Dad. We still are." That night, as Michael lay awake in bed, he thought about how much his father's illness had taken from them. But he also thought about the small moments of connection they still shared. Moments that made it all worth it. Whatever the future held, he was determined to face it, not just for John, but with him. It was a quiet afternoon in Meadow Ridge, the type of day where the hum of cicadas was the loudest sound, broken only by the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog or the distant rumble of a tractor. John sat in his usual spot on the porch, his weathered hands resting on the arms of his chair. His gaze wandered to the dirt road in front of the house, where dust clouds stirred with every passing car. Michael was inside, hunched over his laptop at the dining table, immersed in work. He had set up a baby monitor to keep an ear on his father, a makeshift solution to monitor him while still trying to earn a living. The faint creak of the porch swing was a comforting reminder that John was nearby. Suddenly, John's ears perked up at a sound, a low, guttural growl coming from near the gate. He tilted his head, his confusion giving way to curiosity. Slowly, he rose from the chair, steadying himself against the porch railing, and shuffled toward the sound. When he reached the gate, he saw it, a large German shepherd sitting calmly on the other side. Its golden-brown coat gleamed in the sunlight, and its intelligent amber eyes locked onto John's. The dog wasn't barking or showing aggression. Instead, it sat with a poised intensity, as if it were waiting for something or someone. "Well, aren't you a big fella?" John said softly, gripping the gate. His voice held a mixture of awe and caution. He glanced around the quiet road, searching for signs of an owner, but the dog appeared to be alone. Inside the house, Michael's ears caught the faint murmur of his father's voice. He frowned, stepping away from his laptop to check on him. As he approached the porch, his stomach tightened when he saw John by the gate. "Dad, what are you doing out here?" Michael called, his voice firm but not harsh. John turned toward him, a faint smile playing on his lips. "There's a dog, right here. Look at him." Michael stepped closer, his cautious eyes falling on the German shepherd. The dog remained seated, its ears twitching at Michael's approach but otherwise unmoving. "Where did he come from?" Michael muttered, scanning the road. "There's no one around." "I don't know, but he looks friendly enough," John replied, his hand hovering over the latch of the gate. His instinct to let the dog in was clear, but Michael stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Wait, Dad. We don't know this dog. He could be dangerous," Michael warned, his protective instincts kicking in. John glanced back at the shepherd, his expression softening. "He doesn't look dangerous to me. Look at his eyes, Mike. He's just curious." Michael hesitated, studying the dog's posture. The animal didn't show any signs of aggression. No growling, no bared teeth. In fact, its calm demeanor was almost unnerving. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, but let's be careful." Slowly, Michael opened the gate, and the shepherd stepped forward, its movements fluid and deliberate. John held out a hand, and the dog sniffed it before gently nuzzling his palm. A wide grin spread across John's face. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, chuckling softly. "He likes me." Michael watched the interaction with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Okay, but we need to figure out where he came from. He's too well-fed and clean to be a stray." The dog followed John onto the porch, settling at his feet as though it had known him forever. Michael crouched to get a better look, his eyes narrowing as he noticed a faint scar running along the dog's hind leg. "Looks like he's been through something," he murmured. John patted the dog's head, his face alight with a rare clarity. "Maybe he's looking for a home." Michael's expression softened as he watched his father interact with the dog. For the first time in weeks, John seemed present, engaged with the world around him. Michael stood and crossed his arms, studying the shepherd one last time. "Well," Michael said, "if he's staying, we're going to need a name." John didn't hesitate. "Max. He looks like a Mac." Michael nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "All right, Max it is. But he's sleeping outside." John chuckled, scratching Max behind the ears. "We'll see about that." For the first time in a long while, the house felt different. There was a new energy, a sense of companionship that neither Michael nor John fully understood yet. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and Max lay at John's feet, it was clear that their lives had already begun to change. The following days brought a subtle shift to the rhythm of life at John and Michael's house. Max, the German shepherd, seemed to settle in as though he'd always been there. His presence was quiet but undeniable, like the steady hum of the ceiling fan that punctuated the otherwise silent afternoons. John, who usually spent much of his time lost in fragmented thoughts, appeared more animated. He would sit on the porch with Max by his side, occasionally speaking to the dog in a soft, conversational tone. "You see that bird up there, Max?" John said one morning, pointing toward a sparrow perched on the fence. "Your mom used to say they bring good luck. Funny thing, I can't remember if that's true or just something she made up to make me smile." Max tilted his head, his ears twitching as if he understood every word. John chuckled, running a hand over the dog's thick fur. "You're good company. You know that?" Inside the house, Michael watched from the window, his coffee mug in hand. He'd been skeptical at first about keeping the dog, but now he couldn't deny the positive impact Max had on his father. There was a newfound lightness in John's demeanor, a sense of purpose that had been absent for years. Still, Michael couldn't shake his practical side. One evening, after John had gone to bed, Michael sat at the dining table with his laptop. He pulled up local lost and found pages, scrolling through countless posts about missing pets. He even called the nearest animal shelter to see if anyone had reported a missing German Shepherd matching Max's description. Nothing yet, Michael muttered to himself, closing the laptop with a sigh. As if sensing his frustration, Max padded over and rested his head on Michael's lap. Michael looked down at the dog, his hand instinctively moving to scratch behind Max's ears. "What's your story, huh? Where'd you come from?" Max stared up at him with those sharp amber eyes, and for a brief moment, Michael felt as if the dog was trying to answer him. Shaking his head, he gave Max a pat. "All right, you win. Guess you're staying for now." The bond between John and Max deepened with each passing day. Max became John's shadow, following him from room to room and lying at his feet whenever he sat down. Michael noticed how Max seemed to sense John's mood, offering quiet companionship when his father seemed confused or agitated. One afternoon, John decided to wander into the backyard, Max at his heels. The yard was overgrown in places, with patches of wildflowers sprouting between the cracks in the stone pathway. John knelt near a cluster of yellow blooms, his fingers brushing the petals. "These remind me of her garden," John murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at Max, his expression distant but tender. "She had the greenest thumb, could make anything grow. Even tried to teach me, but I never had the patience." Max settled down beside him, his head resting on his paws. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the golden light of the afternoon stretching across the yard. Later that evening, as Michael was washing dishes, he heard John laughing in the living room. The sound was so unexpected that he nearly dropped a plate. Drying his hands quickly, he stepped into the room to see what was happening. John was sitting on the couch, Max lying beside him with his tail thumping against the floor. On the coffee table was an old deck of cards, scattered as though John had been attempting to play a game. "What's going on in here?" Michael asked, a smile creeping onto his face. John looked up, his eyes twinkling. "I was trying to remember how to play solitaire, and Max here decided to help. Didn't you, boy?" Michael chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not sure he's much of a card player, Dad." "Well, he's better company than you are," John teased, a rare flash of his old humor breaking through. Michael couldn't help but laugh. "Fair enough. Just don't let him hustle you." The light-hearted moment lingered, filling the room with a warmth that had been absent for too long. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel so heavy. As the weeks went on, it became clear to Michael that Max wasn't just a stray dog who had stumbled into their lives. He was a stabilizing force for his father, a silent companion who seemed to bring John a sense of peace. Michael often caught himself watching the two of them together, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Guess you were meant to find us," Michael said one evening, as Max lay curled up at the foot of the couch. The dog didn't respond, of course, but his steady presence was answer enough. Little did Michael know, Max's arrival was just the beginning of a series of events that would test their bond as a family, and their strength to face whatever came next. It was a chilly night in Meadow Ridge, with the kind of stillness that made even the faintest noises echo. The crickets chirped in the tall grass, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves outside. Inside the house, the soft glow of a lamp in the living room cast long shadows across the walls. John had fallen asleep in his recliner, a blanket draped loosely over him, while Max lay alert at his feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the night sounds. Michael was working late in town, having driven to a nearby cafe for better Wi-Fi to complete a project. He had called earlier to check on his father, but the conversation had been short. John had been unusually quiet, a sign that his memory might have been foggier than usual that evening. Max, as always, was Michael's assurance that his father wasn't alone. Around midnight, a faint crunch of gravel broke the night's calm. Max's ears perked up, his sharp eyes scanning the window nearest the door. Another sound followed, a muted shuffle, as if someone were walking softly around the side of the house. Max rose slowly, his powerful frame moving with precision, his tail held low like a predator stalking prey. John stirred in his chair, mumbling something incoherent, but Max didn't break focus. A shadow flickered across the curtains, and Max growled, a low, menacing rumble that seemed to come from deep within his chest. At the same moment, John woke with a start, confused by the sound. "Max?" he called out, his voice shaky. He reached down to touch the dog but froze when he noticed Max's rigid posture and fixed gaze toward the front door. "What is it, boy?" John asked, his tone a mix of concern and fear. The growling grew louder as Max's lips curled, exposing sharp teeth. Then came the noise that confirmed Max's instincts, a faint click at the door handle, followed by the creak of the front porch steps. Someone was trying to break in. "Hey, who's out there?" John shouted, his voice trembling but firm. He reached for the cane resting beside his chair and stood, though his movements were unsteady. Max barked, a deep, resonant sound that reverberated through the house. It wasn't the bark of a frightened dog, but of a protector issuing a warning. The intruders, two men, clad in dark clothing, hadn't expected a dog, let alone one of Max's size and ferocity. One of them cursed under his breath. "There's a damn dog in there," he hissed. "We'll scare it off," the other replied, pulling a crowbar from his bag. He tapped it against the side of the house, a sharp metallic clang meant to intimidate. But Max didn't back down. Instead, he lunged toward the door, barking with even more intensity, his claws scraping against the hardwood floor. Inside, John struggled to keep his balance. His mind was racing, struggling to piece together what was happening. He shuffled toward the door, leaning heavily on his cane. But Max positioned himself in front of him, blocking his path as if to say, "Stay back. I've got this." Suddenly, the sound of glass shattering from the back of the house shattered the tense silence. The second intruder had broken a window to gain entry. Max spun toward the noise, barking furiously, his powerful body coiled and ready to strike. The man stepped through the window, his movements cautious but confident. "It's just an old guy and a dog," he muttered, holding the crowbar tightly. "We'll grab what we need and get out." Max didn't wait for the man to make the first move. With a feral growl, he launched himself at the intruder, his jaws locking onto the man's arm. The man screamed, dropping the crowbar as he struggled to free himself. Max's strength was overwhelming, his grip unrelenting. The commotion woke John fully, and he stumbled toward the noise, his cane clattering to the floor. "Max," he called, panic lacing his voice. He could see the shadowy figure struggling against the dog's attack, but his vision blurred as his mind struggled to process the chaos. Meanwhile, the second intruder tried to force his way through the front door. He managed to kick it open just enough to enter, only to find himself face to face with Max, who had already subdued the first man. Max growled again, baring his teeth, his golden eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. "Forget it. Let's get out of here," the second man yelled, backing away. He grabbed his injured accomplice, dragging him toward the broken window. Max didn't relent, snapping at their heels as they scrambled to escape. By the time the two men disappeared into the night, Max stood tall in the doorway, his chest heaving and his eyes scanning the darkness to ensure they were truly gone. Minutes later, Michael pulled into the driveway, his headlights cutting through the darkness. He noticed the broken window immediately, his heart racing as he rushed inside. "Dad? Dad, are you okay?" he shouted, panic tightening his throat. I'm here," John replied weakly from the living room. He was sitting in his recliner, clutching his cane. Max was by his side, his fur slightly ruffled but otherwise unharmed. "What the hell happened?" Michael demanded, looking from his father to the dog. Someone tried to break in, John said, his voice trembling. Max, he protected me. Chased them off. Michael dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he checked his father for injuries. Are you hurt? No, thanks to him, John said, placing a hand on Max's head. The dog leaned into the touch, his body relaxing for the first time that night. Michael wrapped his arms around Max, burying his face in the dog's neck. You're a damn hero, Max, he whispered, his voice breaking. Thank you. As Michael called the police to report the incident, Max lay down beside John, his eyes still scanning the room, ever watchful. He had proven his loyalty in the most harrowing way, and from that night on, there was no doubt. Max wasn't just a visitor. He was family. Chapter 5. Max in action. The police arrived within 20 minutes of Michael's call. Their flashing lights painted the front yard in bursts of red and blue, and the commotion drew the attention of a few curious neighbors. Officers Cooper and Ramirez, both seasoned members of the Meadow Ridge Police Department, stepped out of their cruiser and approached the house. Michael met them on the porch, his expression a mix of relief and lingering adrenaline. They tried to break in, he said, gesturing toward the shattered window at the back of the house. My dad was here alone. If it weren't for Max, he stopped, glancing down at the German shepherd, who sat calmly by his side, his ears twitching at the unfamiliar voices. We'll take it from here, sir, Officer Cooper assured him, pulling out a notepad. Can we take a look around? Please do, Michael replied, stepping aside to let them in. As they moved through the house, Max stayed close to John, who was still seated in his recliner, a blanket draped over his lap. He looked shaken but unharmed. Michael knelt beside him. Dad, you okay? He asked gently, placing a hand on his father's arm. John nodded slowly, his eyes darting toward Max. I'm fine. Just a bit rattled, I suppose. But Max, he didn't hesitate, Mike. He knew what to do. Michael smiled, though his chest tightened at the thought of what could have happened. Yeah, he's incredible, he said, scratching Max behind the ears. The dog wagged his tail briefly before returning to his watchful stance. Officer Ramirez re-entered the living room after inspecting the property. Looks like they broke in through the back window, she said, her tone professional but sympathetic. There are some footprints in the dirt outside, and it looks like they left in a hurry. You're lucky your dog was here. We are, Michael agreed. Max chased them off before they could hurt my dad. Cooper nodded, looking impressed. Not many dogs would act that decisively. A lot of them get scared when things escalate. You've got a special one here. Michael looked at Max, his heart swelling with gratitude. Yeah, we do. Do you know if they took anything? Ramirez asked. I don't think so, Michael replied, glancing around. Honestly, I think Max scared them off before they could grab anything. Cooper jotted down some notes. We'll file a report and keep an eye out for anyone matching the description. In the meantime, you might want to think about securing the house, reinforcing the locks, maybe installing cameras. And keep that dog around. He's clearly got your back. Michael nodded, already making a mental checklist of what needed to be done. Thank you, officers. As the police wrapped up their investigation and left, Michael turned back to his father, who was still stroking Max's fur absent-mindedly. Dad, you should get some rest, he said gently. It's been a long night. John shook his head. I'm not leaving him, he said firmly, his hand still on Max's back. Not after what he did. Michael sighed but didn't push. He brought John a glass of water and sat down beside him on the couch. Max stretched out on the floor in front of them, his body relaxed but his eyes still scanning the room. You're not just a dog, John murmured, almost to himself. You're a guardian. The next morning, the house was quieter, but the tension from the previous night still lingered. Michael had barely slept, his mind replaying the events over and over. He spent the early hours of the day boarding up the broken window and checking the rest of the house for vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Max stuck close to John, who seemed calmer than Michael expected. After breakfast, Michael decided to post about Max on social media. He uploaded a picture of the dog, his proud posture and intelligent eyes staring into the camera. The caption read, "This is Max. Last night, he stopped 2 intruders from breaking into our home. We're looking for his owner, but if no one claims him, he's staying with us." Within hours, the post began gaining attention. Comments poured in from friends and strangers alike, praising Max for his bravery. Some even suggested that Michael train him as a guard dog, though Michael was already convinced Max didn't need much training in that department. That evening, as Michael and John sat on the porch watching the sunset, Max lay at their feet, his tail wagging lazily. Michael glanced over at his father, who seemed more present than he had in months. "You know," Michael said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I was worried when Max first showed up. I didn't think we could handle the extra responsibility." John chuckled softly, his eyes on the horizon. "You weren't wrong. But sometimes the things we don't think we need turn out to be the most important." Michael nodded, his gaze falling on Max. "Yeah, I think you're right." As the sky turned a deep shade of orange and the stars began to appear, Max let out a contented sigh, his head resting on his paws. For the first time in a long while, the little house in Meadow Ridge felt not just safe, but whole. 2 days after the break-in, life in the little house in Meadow Ridge began to settle. The shattered window had been replaced, and Michael had installed a few basic security cameras around the property. Despite these precautions, it was clear to both Michael and John that Max was their most reliable line of defense. His loyalty and sharp instincts had already proven invaluable. That afternoon, Michael returned home from a quick trip to the hardware store. He pulled into the driveway and noticed Max sitting on the porch beside John, who was rocking gently in his chair. The sight was becoming a familiar comfort, a partnership that seemed almost fated. "Hey, Dad," Michael called out as he stepped from the truck, carrying a bag of tools. "You two holding down the fort?" John waved, a faint smile on his face. "Of course. Max here doesn't let anything get by him." Michael chuckled, walking up the steps and giving Max a scratch behind the ears. "Good boy," he said. The dog leaned into his touch, his tail thumping against the porch. "I picked up a few extra locks and some motion sensor lights. Should give us a little more peace of mind." John nodded but didn't respond. His attention drifted toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip. Michael noticed the far-off look in his father's eyes, a sign that he was retreating into his thoughts. "You okay, Dad?" Michael asked, crouching beside him. John blinked, as if pulled from a dream. "I'm fine, Mike. Just thinking. You've done a lot for me, you know. I don't say it enough, but I see it." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat. He placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You don't have to say it, Dad. I know." John glanced down at Max, who was now lying at his feet. "And this guy," he said, his voice soft. "I don't know where he came from, but it feels like he's been here forever." Michael nodded, his gaze following his father's. "Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Almost like he knew we needed him." That evening, after John had gone to bed, Michael sat in the living room with Max. He scrolled through the comments on his social media post, surprised at how many people had shared it. Most of them were praising Max, calling him a hero, while a few others suggested contacting professional trainers to work with him. One comment, however, stood out. It was from a woman named Teresa, who claimed to have lost a German Shepherd in the area a few weeks earlier. She provided a brief description of her dog, including the scar on his hind leg that Michael had noticed when Max first arrived. Michael stared at the comment, his chest tightening. "Could it be?" he whispered, glancing at Max, who was lying on the floor beside the couch. He didn't want to believe it. The thought of Max belonging to someone else was almost unbearable. In the short time he'd been with them, Max had become more than just a dog. He was family. But Michael knew he couldn't ignore the possibility. With a deep breath, he replied to Teresa's comment, asking for more details and offering to meet. The next morning, Michael didn't mention the comment to John. He didn't want to worry his father, especially given how attached John had become to Max. Instead, he spent the day waiting for a response from Teresa, his phone never far from his side. By late afternoon, Teresa replied. She described her missing dog, his coloring, his size, and the scar. And everything matched Max. She asked if she could come by to confirm. Michael hesitated before responding. He wanted to say no, to claim ignorance and keep Max as their own. But he knew it wasn't right. If Max had a family out there, They deserve to know he was safe. Tomorrow, he typed back. You can come by tomorrow. That night, as Michael lay in bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling. The thought of losing Max felt like losing a piece of their fragile stability. He couldn't imagine how his father would take it. Max, as if sensing Michael's unease, jumped onto the bed and lay down beside him. Michael smiled faintly, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. You're not just a dog, you know that? He said quietly. You're part of us now. Max looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with an almost human understanding. Michael sighed, closing his eyes. Whatever happened tomorrow, he knew one thing for sure. Max had already left an indelible mark on their lives. The following day, Teresa was scheduled to arrive. Michael tried to prepare himself, and his father, for the possibility that Max might not stay. But deep down, he wasn't sure how either of them would handle it if Max had to leave. As the clock ticked closer to her arrival, Michael found himself hoping against hope that she wouldn't show up, or that Max wouldn't recognize her. And yet, as the sound of a car pulling into the driveway echoed through the house, Michael's heart sank. It was time to face the truth. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled both Michael and John's attention toward the window. Max, lying by the front door, instantly perked up. His ears stood tall, and his body tensed as if preparing for something significant. Michael glanced down at him, trying to gauge the dog's reaction. Who's here? John asked, his voice carrying the confusion that often came when something disrupted his routine. Michael hesitated, unsure of how much to explain. Someone who thinks Max might be their dog, he said finally. He knelt beside John, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. I just want to be sure, okay? We'll figure this out. John's face fell, his expression clouding with worry. But Max is ours, he said firmly, his hand reaching for the dog's head. He belongs here. Michael swallowed hard, guilt twisting in his chest. I know, Dad. Let's just see what happens. A woman stepped out of the car, her movements hesitant. Teresa was in her late 40s, with short brown hair and a weathered face that hinted at long days spent working outdoors. Her eyes scanned the porch, locking onto Max almost immediately. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Rocky, she called softly, taking a tentative step forward. Max stood up, his tail wagging slightly as he stared at her. For a moment, it looked as though he recognized her, but then he stayed where he was, not rushing to her as Michael had feared. Michael stepped off the porch to meet her, his stomach churning. You must be Teresa, he said, forcing a polite smile. Yes, she replied, her voice tinged with hope. Her eyes flicked to Max again. That's him. I'd know him anywhere. Michael hesitated, glancing back at Max, who was now sitting by John's side. He hasn't reacted the way I thought he might, Michael said carefully. Let's see how he responds. Teresa approached the porch slowly, crouching down a few feet away from Max. She extended a hand, her voice breaking as she called again. Rocky, it's me. Max's tail wagged again, but his movements were cautious. He sniffed the air, tilting his head, and then took a single step toward her before stopping. Teresa's face fell, a mix of relief and heartbreak playing across her features. It's him, she said softly, looking up at Michael. That scar on his leg. He got that protecting my daughter from a stray dog last year. He's been our family's protector since we adopted him. John, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke. Max isn't Rocky, he said firmly, gripping the arms of his chair as if to steady himself. He's ours. Teresa looked at him, her expression softening when she saw the older man's earnestness. I understand, she said gently, but Rocky's been with us for years. We've been searching for him ever since he got lost during a storm a few weeks ago. John's hand trembled as he reached for Max's fur. He came to us when we needed him, he said. He saved me. Michael felt trapped between the two of them. He turned to Teresa, trying to find the right words. Look, I don't doubt he's your dog, he began, his voice steady but pained. But Max, or Rocky, has become part of our family. My dad. He relies on him. Teresa's eyes filled with sympathy. I can see that, she said, her voice soft. And believe me, I'm grateful he found you. But he's been a part of our lives, too. My daughter. She's been crying herself to sleep since he disappeared. Michael winced, torn by the situation. Before he could respond, John spoke again, his voice stronger this time. Max made a choice, he said, looking directly at Teresa. He chose us. Teresa seemed to consider this, her expression conflicted. She looked at Max, who had moved closer to her now, his nose brushing her hand. A tear rolled down her cheek. "Rocky," she whispered, stroking his head. "I missed you so much." Max wagged his tail, leaning into her touch for a moment before turning back toward John, as if to reassure him. The moment wasn't lost on Teresa. "Maybe," she began, wiping her eyes. "Maybe he belongs here now." Michael blinked, surprised. "Are you sure? This can't be an easy decision." Teresa nodded slowly, her voice breaking. "It's not, but I see how much he means to your dad. And maybe Rocky, Max, knew you needed him more." John's eyes glistened, and he reached down to pet Max. "You're a good dog," he said softly. "You knew where you were needed." Teresa stood, brushing off her jeans. "I'll let my daughter know. She'll be heartbroken, but I'll explain it to her." She paused, looking at Michael. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything," Michael said. "Take care of him," she said. "He's special. He deserves a family who loves him." Michael nodded, his throat tight. "We will. I promise." As Teresa drove away, Max sat by John's side, watching until her car disappeared down the road. Michael knelt beside the dog, wrapping an arm around him. "You're staying, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're home." John nodded, his hand resting on Max's back. "Home," he repeated. "Where he belongs." And in that moment, it felt like the little house in Meadow Ridge had gained not just a dog, but an irreplaceable member of the family. The weeks following Teresa's visit brought a sense of stability back to the house in Meadow Ridge. With Max officially part of the family, the dynamic in the home seemed to shift. There was a quiet confidence in the way John moved around, his steps steadier and his voice stronger. Michael noticed the change, though at first, he chalked it up to coincidence. But as the days turned into weeks, it became undeniable. Max's presence wasn't just comforting, it was transformative. One sunny morning, Michael walked into the kitchen to find John and Max already outside. His father was crouched in the garden, a rare sight since Alzheimer's had made such activities challenging. Max sat nearby, his head tilted as if watching over John. "Dad," Michael called, stepping onto the porch. "What are you up to?" John looked up, holding a small trowel in his hand. A faint smudge of dirt streaked across his forehead. "Just planting some tomatoes," he said casually, as though this were something he'd been doing every day. Michael froze for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. His father hadn't shown this level of initiative in months. "That's great," Michael said, walking over. "Do you need any help?" John shook his head, smiling. "Nope. Max here's all the help I need. Isn't that right, boy?" Max wagged his tail, his amber eyes never leaving John. Michael crouched down beside them, watching as his father worked. The movements were slow and deliberate, but they were steady. "You're doing great, Dad," he said, his voice filled with both pride and a hint of disbelief. John glanced at him, a spark of his old humor returning. "Well, don't just stand there, Mike. Grab a shovel." Later that day, Michael called Dr. Langston, John's physician, to discuss what he'd observed. "It's like he's more engaged," Michael explained. "He's been more active, and his mood is better." Could this be because of Max? Dr. Langston listened carefully before responding. "It's very possible," she said. "Studies have shown that animals, particularly dogs, can have a significant impact on people with Alzheimer's. They provide companionship, reduce stress, and even encourage physical activity." Michael nodded, leaning against the kitchen counter as he processed her words. "It makes sense. Max has been like a lifeline for him. Keep fostering that connection," Dr. Langston advised. "It's not a cure, but it's a powerful tool. And it sounds like Max has already made a world of difference." The changes in John weren't just physical. Emotionally, he seemed more present, more aware of his surroundings. He still had moments of confusion, times when he would ask where his wife was or forget why he had walked into her room, but they were less frequent. And when those moments did come, Max was there to ground him. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, John and Michael sat on the porch with Max lying between them. The air was cool and filled with the faint hum of cicadas. "You know," John said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I don't remember everything these days. But I remember this, sitting here, with you and Max. That feels real." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "It is real, Dad, and it's what matters." John reached down, his hand resting on Max's back. "I think he knows," he said softly. "He knows I need him." Michael nodded, his eyes misting over. "Yeah, Dad, I think he does." Over the next few weeks, John began taking short walks in the yard with Max by his side. What started as hesitant steps soon became more confident strides. Michael watched in awe as his father seemed to reclaim pieces of himself, pieces that Alzheimer's had tried to steal away. One afternoon, as John and Max strolled through the yard, Michael grabbed his camera. He snapped a photo of the two of them, John, standing tall with his cane in one hand and Max on his other side, his loyal shadow. The image captured something Michael hadn't seen in a long time. His father, smiling. Michael posted the photo online with the caption, "Max isn't just a dog. He's a miracle." John's doctor confirmed that the increased activity and improved mood were likely contributing to his overall health. "It's rare to see this kind of improvement," Dr. Langston said during a checkup. "But whatever you're doing, keep it up." Michael knew exactly who to thank. That evening, as he sat with Max on the living room floor, he scratched behind the dog's ears and said, "You've done more for this family than I ever thought possible. You've given us something we thought we'd lost." Max leaned into him, his tail wagging as if to say, "I'm just doing my job." As the days continued, John's progress became a beacon of hope for Michael. While he knew the journey ahead wouldn't be without challenges, he also knew they weren't facing it alone. With Max by their side, there was a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that even in the face of hardship, there was always room for small miracles. The changes in John's health and spirit brought an unexpected sense of balance to Michael's life. For months, his days had been dominated by worry and exhaustion, his mind constantly oscillating between work responsibilities and caregiving. But now, things felt different. Max had become a stabilizing presence in their home, allowing Michael to reclaim a semblance of normalcy. One crisp morning, Michael sat at the dining table with his laptop open, typing furiously as he wrapped up a project. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of dew from the open window. In the background, John's voice carried softly from the porch. "Max, what do you think of this?" John asked, holding up a small wooden birdhouse he'd started painting. "Does this blue look right to you?" Michael paused his typing to glance outside. John sat on a folding table he'd set up on the porch, a palette of paint beside him. Max was lying nearby, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes fixed on John. "You're an artist now, huh?" Michael called out, leaning back in his chair with a smile. John looked up, grinning. "Well, gotta keep busy somehow. Max says it looks pretty good." Michael laughed. "You've got good taste, Mac." Max thumped his tail, as if in agreement. As the weeks passed, Michael found himself growing more productive. Knowing that Max was by his father's side gave him peace of mind during the hours he spent working. He even started taking calls from clients without constantly worrying about having to check on John. But the changes weren't just logistical. Michael began to carve out moments for himself, something he hadn't done in months. On weekends, he took Max for long walks through the open fields behind their house, relishing the quiet companionship the dog offered. Sometimes, they'd stop at a creek where Michael would sit on a large rock, tossing small pebbles into the water as Max splashed in the shallows. "You really have a way of making things better," Michael said during one of these walks, scratching Max's head as the dog shook off water. "I don't think I've felt this grounded in years." Max licked his hand in response, his amber eyes sparkling in the sunlight. John's improvements also encouraged Michael to revisit his own hobbies. He dusted off an old guitar that had been sitting in the corner of the living room for years and started playing again in the evenings. At first, his fingers were stiff, fumbling over the chords, but gradually, The melodies returned. One night, as he strummed a familiar tune, John appeared in the doorway. "Haven't heard you play that in a long time," he said, leaning on his cane. Michael smiled, gesturing to the couch. "Come sit. Maybe you can help me remember the lyrics." John chuckled but complied, settling into his usual spot with Max at his feet. As Michael played, the words came back slowly, halting at first but then flowing more naturally. By the second chorus, John joined in, his voice thin but steady. The sound of their singing filled the room, blending with the gentle hum of the night. Max, ever the watchful companion, stayed close, his presence grounding them in the moment. The new routine brought something to their home that had been missing for years: joy. It wasn't loud or extravagant, but it was steady, a quiet warmth that filled the spaces where grief and worry had once lingered. Michael found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since returning to Meadow Ridge. He'd given up a fast-paced career and a city lifestyle, but in exchange, he'd found something far more meaningful. Max had been the catalyst, but the transformation had been a family effort, a testament to their resilience. One afternoon, as Michael sat at his desk finishing a report, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a comment on the photo he'd posted weeks earlier, the one of John and Max in the yard. The commenter wrote, "This is one of the most inspiring stories I've seen. Max is more than a dog. He's a guardian angel." Michael stared at the comment for a moment, his eyes misting. He glanced over at Max, who was lying on the floor beside John's chair, his tail wagging lazily in his sleep. "Yeah," Michael murmured. "He really is." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Michael, John, and Max sat together on the porch. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that made you feel connected to something bigger. "You know," John said, breaking the silence, "this feels like home again." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It does." Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging gently. He had settled into his place in their lives, not just as a protector, but as a source of hope and connection. For Michael, it was clear. Max hadn't just changed their routine. He'd changed their lives. The days in Meadow Ridge began to blend together in the most peaceful way. Life at the little house found a steady rhythm, one that revolved around John's improving health, Michael's work, and Max's unwavering presence. The once chaotic household now felt harmonious, as if each piece had finally found its place. One crisp autumn morning, Michael woke earlier than usual. The faint glow of sunrise filtered through the blinds, casting a warm light across the room. Stretching, he got up and peeked out the window to see John and Max already in the backyard. John had resumed his morning walks, and today he seemed particularly energized, his steps sure and steady as Max trotted beside him. Michael grabbed a jacket and stepped outside. The air was cool and carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves. "You're up early," he called to his father. John turned, his face lighting up when he saw Michael. "Couldn't waste a morning like this," he replied, tapping his cane against the ground. "Max and I were just checking out the garden." Michael walked over, smiling at the sight of John crouched near a patch of tomatoes. "Looks like they're doing well," Michael said, inspecting the small green fruits. "Yeah, they are," John agreed. Glancing at Max, "He keeps the critters away. Best scarecrow I've ever had." Michael laughed, crouching down next to his father. "You've been busy," he remarked, noticing how neatly the garden had been tended. "It helps me think," John said, his tone thoughtful. He looked at Michael, his expression unusually lucid. "You've done a lot for me, Mike. I know it hasn't been easy." Michael felt his throat tighten. "Dad, you don't have to." "No, let me finish," John interrupted gently. "I might not remember everything, but I know this. You gave up a lot to be here, and I'm grateful for it." Michael swallowed hard, nodding. "I'd do it all over again," he said honestly. "You're my dad. That's what family's for." John smiled, his hand resting on Max's head. "And this guy," he said, his voice softening. "He gave us something we didn't even know we needed." Michael reached over, scratching Max behind the ears. "Yeah, he did." As autumn deepened, Michael decided to take things a step further to cement their new routine. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, researching part-time caretakers. He loved being there for his dad, but he knew having extra support could help them maintain the balance they'd found. After a few days of phone calls and interviews, Michael found someone who seemed like a perfect fit. A local woman named Lisa, who had experience working with older adults with Alzheimer's. She came by for a trial visit, and it didn't take long for her to click with John. "I'll just be here to help with the little things," Lisa explained to John during her first visit, her tone warm and patient. "Cooking, cleaning, maybe running some errands." John seemed skeptical at first, but Max's immediate approval of Lisa helped ease his concerns. The dog wagged his tail enthusiastically, nudging her hand for pets. "Well, if Max likes you, I guess I can give you a chance," John said with a chuckle. Michael watched the exchange with relief. Having Lisa around would give him more freedom to focus on work and even take time for himself, something he hadn't done in years. One Saturday, Michael decided to take Max on an adventure. The two of them drove to a nearby hiking trail, where the autumn leaves created a brilliant canopy of reds, oranges, and yellows. Max bounded ahead on the path, his energy infectious. As they walked, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the journey they'd been through. "You've changed everything, you know that?" he said to Max, who turned and wagged his tail as if to agree. "I don't think I ever realized how much we needed you." The hike ended at a scenic overlook, where Michael sat on a large rock, the town of Meadow Ridge stretching out below. Max lay at his feet, panting softly. For a long time, Michael sat in silence, letting the cool breeze wash over him. He felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good, better than he ever thought it could be when he first moved back to Meadow Ridge. Back at home, John was waiting on the porch when Michael and Max returned. "How was the hike?" John asked, his tone light. "Great," Michael replied, letting Max off his leash. The dog immediately ran to John, wagging his tail and nuzzling his hand. John chuckled, rubbing Max's head. "You're lucky, you know," he said to Michael. "Not every family gets a second chance." Michael nodded, his chest tightening. "Yeah, I know." That evening, as the three of them sat in the living room, the house felt warmer than ever. John dozed off in his recliner, and Max curled up on the rug at his feet. Michael watched them both, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. They had been through so much together: loss, uncertainty, fear, but they had found their way. Max had brought them more than protection. He had brought them hope, connection, and the strength to keep moving forward. In the quiet of the evening, Michael realized something. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of a new one. Together, they had built a life worth cherishing, one filled with love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's truly heartwarming.